talk in many ways picked up where my TED talk left off. So I gave that talk in 2014 in Brazil, and it was about the relationship between identity and nationality, or the extent to which where we come from shapes who we become. In that talk, I suggest that our nationalities are far less important than our localities, or the sum of our local experiences, in informing our senses of self. But ever since giving that talk, I've been asked the same one question in just about every Q&A. And that question is, if I believe that nationality matters less and less, should we then, as a consequence, do away with nations? And in many ways, the question is moot. We shouldn't, can't, and more to the point, won't abolish nations. But I think that if we're honest, we can understand those who would. Unless you are a raving nationalist, in which case I should say congratulations, this really is your year, then you likely have some doubts about the nation. Nations, countries, nation states, the terms alone can be confusing. I'm going to use the term the state. And for the past 2 weeks, I've been going around asking people what's the first thing they think of when they hear that phrase, the state. The answers were sort of telling. They were state taxes, crackdown, corruption, and war. So the fact is, in October of 1648, the state, as we know it, came into being and has been consistently and continuously a shit show ever since. Rogue states, puppet states, captured states, crony states, failing states. This month, October of 2022, marks exactly 375 years of dysfunction. States have murdered minorities, invaded neighbors, suppressed women, oppressed workers, and that's just this year alone. We need to talk about states. There are 193 in the world, and they're all defined in two ways. One is geographically, so a state is a single continuous geography with globally recognized borders. And then number two, politically, as a sovereign autonomous unit. So I'm going to take you back to university a little bit and just give you some basics on statehood. If you get too bored, just stand up and wave your hands, and I'll roll it back. Why? Why do states exist? What is a state by definition? Who does it serve? And how could it possibly be better? These are the questions I'd like to ask. Why, what, who, and how? So why? Why do states exist at all? A simple answer might be because human beings are not as nice as we might like to think. So in a recent experiment, a neuroscientist gathered a diverse group of highly educated subjects. Each of these subjects had a single identity that meant a great deal to them. So Black, white, Muslim, Jewish, gay, transgender, etc. The neuroscientists put each subject in front of a video of moving hands. The hands were just moving around freely. And on each hand was written one identifier: Black, white, Muslim, Jewish, gay, transgender, etc. The subjects were hooked up to monitors, which could keep track of their vitals, and asked to watch as the hands moved. And then suddenly, out of the blue, one of the hands was stabbed. It looked as if the hand started splurting blood. It looked as if the person who was stabbed was in actual jeopardy. But what the neuroscientists observed was this. The subject had a physical reaction to the stabbing, that's increased heart rate, shortness of breath, only when the hand said something with which the subject identified with. So for example, the Jewish woman had a reaction if she saw a hand that said Jewish or woman stabbed, but a Muslim man, she stayed perfectly calm. And this was true for all the subjects. No one reacted physically when a hand was stabbed unless something about that hand had something to do with them. I would say that this is somewhat horrifying news, but it gets even worse. So the neuroscientists ran the very same test with different words on the hands. This time when the subjects came in for the study, they were separated into two groups, the purple group and the green group. The subjects knew that the colors were completely arbitrary. It was just a way to divide the two teams, but they knew that they were purple or that they were green. They were hooked up to monitors, asked to watch the moving hands. And again, this time, instead of having an identifier, the hand said purple or green. As before, the subject had a physical, visceral reaction to seeing a hand stabbed, only if it said the color of the group they were in. So the purple group reacted physically only when the purple hand was stabbed, the green group the same. What does this tell us? That, neurologically speaking, human beings lack compassion. At a very visceral level, we care about what happens to us and feel little about the suffering of them. Said differently, our us versus them thinking is so hardwired that it doesn't matter what defines us: religion, gender, and arbitrary color assigned 10 minutes ago. It doesn't matter what the divider is, our bodies respond to the world on the basis of division. From an empathy perspective, this should trouble us, but from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. Human beings are hardwired also for survival. Our earliest ancestors were quite literally incapable of surviving alone. In the face of hostile weather and food insecurity, we needed the tribe to survive. Being safe meant being in a group. The tribe was our best bet for survival, and we needed to know which tribe we were in. The first tribe was the family. Expanding out from there, we get the clan, the tribe, the kingdom, and then the state. The state is just the last in a very long line of units that have existed to answer one question: who is purple and who is green? Who is us and who is them? Why do states exist? Because human beings crave tribes. We need to know who will keep us safe in the face of drought or winter. We need to know who to cheer for in the World Cup if it's not Ghana. We need to know whether to rescue the ship or let the migrants drown. Why do states exist? Because human beings crave tribes. So that's why, number one. But let's look at what, number two. What is a state, a nation, a country, a nation state? What's the difference? When people want to sound fancy, I tend to hear them say nation state instead of country. But while state and country are synonymous, nation state has a very specific meaning. So a state, as I said, is a territory with recognized sovereign borders. Canada, Nigeria, though it's lost on Mr. Putin, Ukraine. A nation is a group of human beings bound by shared language, heritage, and culture. So the Berber nation, the Yoruba nation, the Basque nation, etc., the Turkic nation. For example, originally a nomadic people from Central Asia, the Turks established an empire before the creation of the Turkish state. Today, members of the Turkish nation reside in various states, and the Turkish state is home to human beings from various nations: the Kurdish nation, the Armenian nation, the Roma nation. You get it. Simply put, the nation is a cultural unit, the state is a political one. We can think of the nation state then as a political unit in which 95% of the population or more belongs to the same cultural unit. A nation state is a state in which everyone shares the same language, heritage, or culture. The biggest nation state in the world is Bangladesh, occupied almost entirely by the Bengali nation, and the second is Egypt, occupied almost entirely by the Egyptian nation, including Copts. So, of 193 states in the world, only about 20 are nation states. The rest of us are just states. Why does this distinction matter? Okay, let's go back to the stabbed hands. Remember, nation is history, culture, language. State is territory and borders. When everyone within the borders and living on the land belonged to the same nation, it was easy to define national interest. It's no surprise that amongst the top 10 most peaceful countries in the world are 6 of the least diverse. States were designed to serve the interests of a single nation, a single tribe, and moreover, the ruling elite thereof. One state, one culture. But for most states in the world, that ship has sailed. The nationalism that we're seeing now isn't about patriotism or countries. It's about nations that don't live in nation states, but appear not to know it. We're all waking up from the American dream. According to that dream, anyone in the world can be not just successful, but a successful American. If you drink the American soda and eat the American pie and take the American hypertension and diabetes medication, then you too can be an American. To this, the American nationalist says no. Unless you share our history, language, and culture, you're not part of our nation, you're not one of us, you are not American. If your history begins with slave ships instead of the Mayflower, if you speak Mexican Spanish instead of American English, if you eat baklava instead of Burger King, then you don't belong to the tribe, and the tribe won't keep you safe. The fundamental question in 21st century statehood may well be this: what happens when different cultural units occupy the same political one? How do we define national interest when members of different nations live in one state? in a state where people speak Catalan and Castellano, or Persian, Kurdish, and Azerbaijani, or Sardo, Somali, and Siciliano? In whose interest does the state act? This is the trickiest question. Who, in whose interest do states act? We like to anthropomorphize the state, to give it human characteristics. So we'll say Russia held talks with China as if Russia and China were people drinking coffee. Or we'll say the United States lifted sanctions against Cuba, or Iran murdered Masa Amini. It's a kind of shorthand, I know, but I find it a dangerous one, because when we say the state took an action, we obscure two crucial facts. One, which specific human beings are entitled to act in the name of the state, and two, in the interest of which other specific human beings have they acted. Iran, for example, can be credibly said to be, quote, acting in the interest of national security, but by murdering Iranian citizens, many of whom don't belong to the Persian nation. Who? States are comprised of human beings, the people we call citizens. Governments are comprised of human beings, the people we call leaders. Are these leaders doomed to doing harm, as Russia, Iran, the American police would suggest? Or is the state, like the individual human beings of which it's comprised, capable of change, of growth, of transformation? Might the state, that engine of demonstrable harm, become a force for good? As we know, the surest way for a human being to transform is to become conscious. How might states become conscious too? How would we define the conscious state? Well, first let's define consciousness. Medically, to be conscious is to be aware of and responding to one's surroundings. Very simple. Psychologically or spiritually, to be conscious is to be aware of the self, internally and externally. Let's say then that the conscious state would be one, responsive, and two, self-aware. The conscious state would respond to, rather than ignoring, its present reality, aware of its internal identity, its purpose, its obligation to the humans inside it, and aware of its external identity, its impact on the globe. To be honest, today we're hard-pressed to find examples of one conscious state amongst 193. What we can find are examples, heartening examples, of conscious statecraft. So Finland recently became the first state to do away with traditional school subjects, history, math, etc. State leaders became conscious of the fact that their school system had been designed in and in response to the 19th century, and aware of and responding to their surroundings, so conscious, Finnish leaders decided to redesign the curriculum to suit the 21st century, conscious statecraft. Rwanda. Following the 1994 genocide, Rwandan leaders outlawed national or tribal affiliations. Today, you can no longer be a member of the Hutu nation, the Tutsi nation, you can only be Rwandan. And from there, it gets even better. From there, they instituted a national day of cleaning. So on the last Saturday of every month, every Rwandan, not a Hutu, not a Tutsi, but a Rwandan, cleans up their streets. That's because it's no longer that tribe's problem, that tribe's beach, that tribe's forest, it's Rwanda's. This is conscious statecraft. Iceland. Iceland is a fishing country, as everybody knows, but its leaders recognized that if they didn't act, the country would overfish itself to death. They implemented what's called a catch limitation system, which sets limits on how much you can fish of each type of fish. To do this, state leaders had to redefine us versus them. If us is the shareholders of a single fishery, limits make no sense. Winner takes all. When us is redefined as both the country and the generations to come, when state leaders are conscious of a new kind of us, then a new kind of politics becomes possible. Nigeria. No great beacon of consciousness, my beloved Nigeria, but nevertheless, its leaders recently took an incredibly conscious act to ban foreign models and foreign accents in advertising. Some small group of Nigerian leaders became responsive and aware that Nigeria is a brown-skinned country with a colonial past, aware of the physical and mental effects on women in particular, with skin bleaching and fad dieting and low self-esteem, aware, responsive, and so conscious. These leaders took action, conscious statecraft. Then there's external awareness. Ecuador. In 2008, Ecuador became the first state to recognize the rights of nature at a constitutional level. And then this year, they expanded the constitution to include animals as well. Australia just voted to protect its extinction-level animals. These leaders have become conscious of the effect of their state on the external world, on the natural world. From that place of awareness, they've sought to minimize harm, conscious statecraft. In an interconnected world, external awareness becomes the more critical. Still, it remains the most elusive. So a counterexample is Sweden. Sweden is often counted amongst the 10 most peaceful countries in the world. And this never struck me as odd. I mean, Sweden. But then I learned that Sweden is also regularly counted amongst the top 20 arms-dealing countries in the world. And I asked myself, how is this possible? How can a country that deals arms to other countries be considered peaceful, and by whom? There's a blindness there, a common one, a blindness to connectedness, to the relationship between internal identity, peaceful, and external identity, arms dealing. So the cycle goes, deal arms, gain wealth, wealthier citizens, happier citizens, more peaceful country, and less peaceful world. To make that, to square that, to circle that, you have to create a huge division, a huge rupture between internal identity and external identity, the kind of rupture that consciousness doesn't allow. Perhaps a simple definition of the conscious state would be this: a state in which leaders, the human beings elected to represent the other human beings called citizens, a state within which leaders seek to protect three entities. Number one, the citizens of the state, regardless of their heritage. Number two, the citizens of the globe, regardless of their passport. And number three, the globe itself. Now, it can sound a little naive, imagining a redefinition of the state. I know that. But the fact is, we've done this before. Back in that other October of 1648, world leaders gathered to reimagine what the state could be. And they did this in response to 110 years of war. After the 80 Years' War and the 30 Years' War, world leaders said, enough. We need a new system. We need something other than kingdoms. We need to do away with church versus state. We need some kind of principle of non-intervention, or else we're going to be at war for the next 100 years. It worked only in part. The principle of non-intervention did not apply, obviously, to colonizers. But there is something to be said for the fact that this reimagining happened at all. To expand beyond the family, the clan, the church, and to embrace the state, the abstract notion of the state required a shift in consciousness. When the ruling elite of the global community decided enough was enough, they shifted their consciousness, they rewrote the rules, and then we did it again. In the wake of the 2 world wars, then the civil wars of the 1990s, we asked ourselves new questions. Can non-intervention remain the golden rule in the face of humanitarian crime? Can you agree not to invade a state if the state is killing its own citizens? Is separation of church and state sufficient without democracy? History teaches that we have the capacity for this kind of shift in consciousness. The question is, what does it take to generate the will? Historically, it's taken epic catastrophe to bring the world community to the table. Can we get to consciousness, I ask, without catastrophe? And if not, how bad does it have to get before we do? It's easier for us to sit here and question state policy than it is to craft it. But it is precisely this kind of questioning that has historically brought about change. Conscious states require conscious leaders, which require conscious voters, which require conscious citizens. It is difficult to be a conscious citizen when you are struggling to pay your mortgage, to put food on the table, to afford heat for the winter. This we know. There are no easy answers here. What is here is hope. Finland, Rwanda, Iceland, Nigeria, the humans who lead these states, Ecuador, Australia, suggest that for the state, that beleaguered shit show with 375 years of harm at its back, these states and their conscious statecraft suggest that another path is available if only we would choose to take it. Thank you.